So if you were at any of the business development webinars over the course of this quarter, this crash course will be going over um, all of that material in a much more condensed form. And then I'll be talking a little more specifically as to how those different these different topics affect the submissions, how they're related. So we are covering 5 main points. We're going to be talking about problem identification, specifically the traditional problem solution approach, as well as the jobs to be done approach. We're going to be talking about market validation and how to consider external factors. We're going to be doing some preliminary competitor analysis, pretty high level stuff, nothing too specific. We're going to be talking about the business model canvas, going over each component and how they're related. And we're, of course, also going to talk about strategic planning. Are there any questions before we get started with the material? Cool. Oh, something in the chat. Yes, so the presentation is being recorded and will likely be uploaded to YouTube. Yeah. By when, I'm not sure, but we'll try to get that up quickly. So in order to identify a problem kind of from scratch, if you don't already have something in mind, the approach I like to take is just start with an interest area or a problem area. Kind of a problem area is pretty generally just the industry or the area of interest that you and your team want to approach. So for example, you might choose satellite technology as like an industry you want to work in, or fintech as an area of interest, upcycling as kind of a mode of creating value, things like that. And so once you have a problem area, once you have kind of figured out, I want to work in this sector, it's a lot easier to get progressively more specific. And by limiting your scope more so after each step. So an example of this would be, say I want to solve global warming. Global warming is too big of a problem. You can't do it, right? But we can solve, smaller components of it. So maybe not global warming, the causes of it, but let's focus on the symptoms. Let's help out with what we can figure out right now. One of those symptoms might be rising sea levels, and specifically the impact of rising sea levels on coastal communities. That right there, that's our problem, right? That's what we're going to go after. So we've gone from global warming and narrowed it down to something a little more specific. And so with this with this first piece of information, i.e. your problem or your problem area, you should be able to figure out who to talk to next. So something I always advise to do for startups or for projects in general is make as few assumptions as possible, or at least validate the assumptions that you do make as quickly as possible. So, in the context of impacting the impact of rising sea levels on these coastal communities, I would assume that houses have to be built, with some elevation. Like you have to prop it up somehow. Like that's just an assumption that might make sense to me. But maybe that's not a best practice that's actually implemented. In order to validate my assumption, I'd have to figure out who to go and talk to. So maybe I want to talk to real estate developers that specialize in coastal communities, as an example. So starting these customer interviews really early is a really good way to reduce the need for assumptions, to validate assumptions early on, and to kind of avoid going down a bad path that might lead to a poorly designed product or service. So talking about customer interviews, originally we wanted to have an entire workshop on how to conduct these customer interviews. We ended up not scheduling that for Startup Week just due to time constraints. That said, I do want to provide something for you in case you haven't done customer interviews before. So this isn't meant to be an exhaustive guide by any means, but it should hopefully be enough to get started. So the first thing is figure out what you want to learn. What are the questions that you want answered? And often these are general. So, I've been interviewed by startups, not for like a job, but for like, their customer interviews or whatever. And the question that they asked a lot is, what sucks about this? What sucked about the manufacturing process you went about? Or like, what would you do better? Like, lots of kind of open-ended questions. Avoid yes and no sorts of things, because often, that's not going to give you useful information, and it might even give you biased information, because it's very easy to frame yes/no questions in such a way that, well, I mean, the answers are already binary, so just in general, they're not that useful. And additionally, in the customer interview section of the submission, we very specifically want you to indicate what information you're seeking in your customer interviews. And that's something that you can identify whether or not you're able to do customer interviews. So that's quite important for this competition. The second kind of step, or tip rather, would be to write a script of these questions. Now, we're not writing a movie, so we can't, write every response, every line. We can't perfectly determine the outcome of our conversations with our customers. But what we can do is anticipate what they might respond to, or with, rather. So when you're writing a script of questions, your initial questions are going to be going after that information that you want. It's going to be, well, how do you build homes on the coast? What are best practices? But maybe you want to set up some follow-up questions for responses you might expect, or maybe might not expect. So say I'm totally off base with my assumption with, all houses are elevated on the coast, or at least new houses rather. A very simple follow-up question would be why? Why is that the case? Why is that best practice? And a lot of these questions you're going to be coming up with on the fly, because that's how human conversations work. But it's always good to go into those conversations very well prepared. You should run out of time. You should not run out of questions. With all that said, don't force your conversations. Don't, if it doesn't make sense to go from question 1 to question 2, because the conversation has gone down a different rabbit hole, then skip to whatever question makes the most sense in the context of the situation. This is one of those situations where it helps to be a people person. It helps to understand the flow of a conversation. And unfortunately, that's one of those things that you kind of just have to learn through experience. So hopefully you've done a lot of talking in the past couple of months, lots of human interaction. Yeah, so you have an agenda, but the most useful information does come from, well, it does not come from highly structured conversations. It comes from things that are more natural. And the third step is just have the interviews. See how it goes. Don't schedule them back to back, because you're going to want to take detailed notes or have someone else to take detailed notes. And then you're going to want to iterate on your script based on what you've learned from each interview. So, in that example of coastal communities, I discovered I'm totally off base with my assumptions. I don't want to ask that same question to the second real estate developer. Clearly I was wrong, and I've already had this massive kind of shift in perception of this problem. So I'm going to rewrite, or at least edit, my script to kind of to take that into account. That said, don't base your entire knowledge off of a single interview. It is important to have those second, third, fourth, fifth, and so on interviews to further validate any assumptions or conclusions that you've made, and just to learn about your industry, about your problem. So now that you've interviewed plenty of customers, theoretically you should be armed with enough information to draft your first problem statement. Problem statements are those things that anyone who's ever taken a class in entrepreneurship has been introduced before. If you've come to the Student Startup Center, if you come to our events, you've probably heard us mention it, heard someone else talk about it, and surely seen someone deliver one. Generally speaking, problem statements come in the form of this group of people experience this problem, which is an issue because of some impact of that problem. Now, this is very cookie cutter, and personally, I don't like cookie cutter approaches. I think that you should tailor suit your problem statement to your problem, bring in the information that's most relevant to me. But at the end of the day, I do want to know those three pieces of information. I want to know what the problem is, who experiences, and why do I care? Or at least why do they care? So yeah, the most critical thing is that your problem statement clearly defines the problem that you are solving. So that said, the problem solution approach is not the only approach to identifying what you're going to do as a company, as a startup. Another approach that I really like is the jobs to be done approach, and it's kind of self-explanatory. The jobs to be done approach is really useful when identifying potential competitors, more so than when trying to actually identify your initial problem. And the reason why this is the case is because jobs to be done aren't necessarily problems. They're more like opportunities, if you will. If I need to wake up in the morning, if I need something to bring me up to speed, physically, you could say I have the problem of being lethargic in the morning, but that can take you down so many different rabbit holes. Something that's a little more practical would be, well, what job do I want done? I want to be caffeinated. I want to wake up in the morning. So identifying the job of, something to wake me up in the morning is going to be much more conducive to identifying what your product or service is very quickly. But again, neither approach is, or rather each approach is going to be more useful in specific situations. So in that situation, maybe I want to go with jobs to be done. In the case of something more esoteric like global warming, yeah, problem solutions probably going to be more useful. With all that said, we can rewrite our problem statement in the context of jobs to be done. I guess you could call it the job statement or job to be done statement, but the problem statement is fine enough. So this might be, this group of people require this job to be done, and they're dissatisfied with, whatever the current option is, with the inadequacies in that current option. And that is an issue because of the impact of this inadequacy. So, the example of, caffeine in the morning to wake me up. For groups of people, you might want to say young professionals or college students, and they require caffeination in the morning, something to wake them up. That's the job to be done. They're dissatisfied, with whatever the current option is. Maybe it's, I brew my own coffee in the morning, but I'm too lazy to do that every day. So that's the inadequacy. It requires work. And that's an issue because, well, I'm not getting my job done because this inadequacy prevents me from doing the job. So that might help you kind of identify how you wanna craft your product or your service. And so the really useful thing with jobs to be done, and why I would actually recommend using both the traditional method as well as this method, is that they're really useful in identifying competitors. When you're talking about the problem solution approach, your competitor is someone who's offering the same or very similar solution. But in often cases, especially in the startup world, you don't have any competitors because nobody's doing what you're doing. And that's kind of the whole point. Well, if you look at the jobs to be done approach, now the conversation shifts. Competitors are not people who are crafting your solution. Competitors are people who are doing your job. And that's much more useful because jobs can be done in very different ways. I can hammer a nail with a hammer, sure, but I could probably also figure out how to do it with a wrench. It's not going to look as pretty, it's not going to be done as well, but it still gets the job done. So in that case, a wrench somehow is a competitor to a hammer for hammering nails. So this approach kind of entails, again, answering that simple question, who is doing this job? And often you can get that information from customer interviews, which is why, we really, really stress that you should be doing customer interviews, at least one or two. Um, for example, you might be asking a customer, well, how are you dealing with this issue now? What is your current solution? And that, might point towards a competitor. Sometimes the response will be like, I'm just not dealing with this issue. It's just, there. But in my experience, you'll often be met with a more creative, surprising response, a different way of solving their problem. So your challenge as an entrepreneur, as a new entrepreneur, is to create a product or a service that is valuable and or at a better cost than any of the customer's other options. So once you've taken this approach and you've identified all of your potential competitors, you need to figure out, well, why am I better than them? Or how do I need to be better than them in this situation where you haven't developed a product or a service yet? So let's give an example. I am an engineering major. I love space, so I'm going to stick with what I know. And my problem area generally is going to be space travel. Let's say I go through the process of whittling that down into something more specific, and I land on ISRU, in situ resource utilization, which is a really fancy name that basically means living off the land, using resources that are nearby to take care of your basic needs, just in space. And so when I'm going into my customer interviews, the information that I'm interested in identifying is what are the gaps in technology that are readily available, preventing ISRU from occurring now? Like what's stopping us from just going to the moon, going to Mars, and like harvesting oxygen from the dirt? Why aren't we doing that already? And hypothetically, let's say I call up NASA, I call up SpaceX, I call up Sierra Nevada, Lockheed, all of these companies that work on these issues. And the feedback more or less that I get is most, if not all of the technology, it's already done. It was invented in the 60s, but nobody's put it together. That is, no one has integrated and implemented ISRU, even though we're capable of doing it. So by starting with a general problem area and whittling it down, figuring out the information that I want to get from my potential customers, I know I don't necessarily have like a really specific problem, but rather I have a job that needs to be done. My job is to integrate this technology. So again, I can phrase this both ways. So my problem statement, the more traditional approach might be NASA and other space agencies cannot execute ISRU operations in space, which prohibits long-term human exploration and study in space. So that last part is the impact. They can't do what they want to do because they don't know how to do ISRU, or they don't have the materials to do it. Now, alternatively, the jobs to be done statement might be NASA and other space agencies. So the group of people is the same. They need to conduct ISRU operations in space. That's the job. But have thus far only invented pieces of the technology required for ISRU. That's the inadequacy, which is an inadequate solution as these subsystems could not operate nor survive in space without the additional systems supporting it. So that's kind of the impact, but that actually kind of more leads to what I'm going to be doing or what our company should be doing. So those are two pretty specific examples of the process of identifying a broad problem area, getting specific, and eventually coming up with those statements that lead to your product or service development. So this is all like step one. This is figuring out what am I doing, right? I guess there's more to this example. Who are my competitors? Again, this is where jobs to be done is really useful. Under the problem solution approach, no one's my competitor. Nobody's doing this. Awesome, let's go. Investors are going to love this. I'm first in the ballpark, right? But under the jobs to be done approach, well, now I've shifted my perspective and I say, who else does system integration? There's a lot of large companies that do that. Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, those people are now my competitors, which is kind of scary. It's like, oh man, I'm going up these, several billion-dollar defense companies. That's my competition. But maybe that might be useful. Maybe we'll get bought out by them in the future. if you go with the problem solution approach, you've kind of totally subverted yourself from identifying your real competitors. And competitors are useful because you can use them to kind of identify, well, what should your competitive advantages be? If I'm not a large company, what can I do? I'm more mobile. As a startup, we can move quickly, fail quickly, iterate, all that fun stuff. As a large company, it's not that conducive to that type of behavior. So that is the whole problem identification kind of bit. Are there any questions thus far? And feel free to put them in the chat. Cool. So we're going to move on now to market validation and external factors. So Bill Owlett, he's the head of MIT's Entrepreneurship Center. He says that a business is only a business if it has paying customers. I want to extend that just a bit to say that a business also has to have a product or service. It's like, duh, what are they paying for, right? Owlett's definition is great, but this is just kind of for functional purposes within this presentation. So additionally, if a business is to thrive, it needs a market to do so in. So in order for our market to be validated, it has to have paying customers and it has to have a need for our product or service. Those are our two goals, right? Cool. So Anthony asked in the chat, how would you approach interviewing customers in the current situation of Corona? That's a great question. The nice thing about customer interviews is rarely are they in person anyways. Generally people just call up, cold call, right? I would say the only difference might be, if you might want to use like Zoom or Google Hangouts or something else to have, I guess, more face-to-face type interactions if that's necessary. But I would actually approach it in the same way that I would approach it in the before times, just cold call. So going back to market validation, that's our goal, is to validate the market, to say, okay, we can operate in this sector. And so by using Owlett's definition and my addition, we're saying that in order for a market to be validated on a very high level kind of point of view, it needs paying customers and a need for our product or service. So with that said, there are different markets that you can talk about. You have your total addressable market, which is like anyone who has kind of a remote need for your product. It's anyone that you could anyone that would conceivably buy your stuff. You have your serviceable obtainable market, your SOM, which is a little bit smaller than that, and that's sort of that's people that you can realistically serve and provide. That's more or less where you're going to max out with your individual product. And then you have your serviceable attainable market, addressable. I'm probably mixing those two up. It doesn't matter. But your smallest market can also be called your beachhead market. And the reason why this is the case is because it's your initial target group of customers. It's, day one, who are you going after? The reason why this is important is because if you're going after your TAM, your total addressable market on day one, you're going to run out of resources. It takes a lot of capital, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of manpower in order to acquire a large number of customers. And as a startup, you don't have those resources. You have time, sure, but you don't have money or necessarily manpower. So a more feasible approach is to choose an initial group of customers, a beachhead market, and to acquire them as customers first. So when you're choosing a beachhead market, there are two key aspects that you want them, two boxes that you want to check. You want them to be very well funded, and that makes a lot of sense. You need them to pay you. You need money as a startup. So you should make sure that they have money. broke college students is never a good beachhead market. And they should also be well connected. And the reason for that is, as you're trying to grow into those, more adjacent markets, you're going to want to utilize word of mouth, as well as just the general credibility you've developed with this market. And the best way that credibility extends from one market to another is if your beachhead is well connected to those markets. So, for example, let's say my beachhead market is young business professionals, so people that work at companies like Accenture or Salesforce, those sorts of companies. That's my beachhead. And as I spread out, I want to acquire maybe other kind of types of professionals, maybe engineers, maybe marketers, those sorts of things. So because I've identified business people who kind of probably interact with different aspects of the business, they're well connected with those different professions. And so they're likely to be able to like, oh, hey, you should try out this product that I've been using. It's like super dope or whatever. And that's just kind of one super general example. The other thing is, if you can't find a good beachhead market, then your market might not be valid. So if you're going after broke college students, that's your initial, hey, this is what I'm going after. There's not a lot of college students that aren't broke. There are definitely some, but there's not a lot of. So your market might not be valid. That said, you can always redefine what your market is, or rather who your customers are. So, one misnomer or misbelief rather, is that the individual or the group of people that use your product are your customers. In most cases, yes, that's true, but often it might not be. So the best example of this is social media. Facebook's customers are not us, the users. Facebook's customers are ad agencies. That's who they get money from. So look at potentially redefining what your market is if you found that your market might not be valid. So ensuring that your product or service is adequate for your market is pretty difficult. I don't know the surefire way of figuring out whether your product is going to sell or not. And the only real proof is in your sales and your growth. If you're selling your product and if you're continuing to grow, then your product's probably good. There are, however, a few things that you can do to maximize your chances of success. The first, and one that is required for this competition, is develop and test an early MVP. We're going to be talking a lot about MVP tomorrow. Yeah, and all of that is that the minimum viable product. It's basically what's the minimum thing that you need, the cheapest, the quickest thing to produce that shows that your idea is valid. So if I want to sell an electric car, it's going to cost so much money to build a prototype, right? I don't necessarily want to do that. So what's my minimum viable product? What's my MVP? Well, people already drive cars and people already want things electrified, and pretend Tesla doesn't exist, because duh. So I can point to those two examples and say, that's my minimum viable product. I didn't develop it, I didn't do it, but it's in use right now. And if you can make a good argument to say, this is already being used right now by people, we're just making a different version of it. That's a pretty good way to argue that your company, that your product or your service is valid. The other thing is be emotionally and technically prepared to throw ideas away and to iterate. What I mean by emotionally is don't get caught up with an idea. Don't fall in love with something, because you might have to throw it in the garbage because it turns out you're the only one that likes it. And also be technically prepared to do this, and also prepared in a operations kind of perspective. If you invest so heavily into a product and it turns out that it and all of the technology that went into it are totally useless, then you've just wasted a lot of money. But if you instead develop that technology in such a way that you might be able to easily pivot, you know, then that's probably good. I guess an example of that might be if you've watched the television show Silicon Valley, the company which is kind of at the center of that show, Pied Piper, they develop essentially a compressing algorithm. It just takes your files and makes them smaller for storage. And it turns out nobody really cared. Like, the stuff we have already is good enough. So they used that technology and they changed it, tweaked it a little bit, and made it into a new product, which was a decentralized internet. That's a fictional case, of course, but its technical merit is valid. And then the third thing would be to have sound justifications for any assumptions you make along the process. So with startups, especially with startups involving more inexperienced founders, like I would expect a lot of college students to be, I certainly would be, you're going to make a lot of assumptions. So having justifications, being able to make arguments for those assumptions is quite important. And perhaps you have people in your circle to push you on those issues, to push you on your assumptions, to argue with you, and that would be fantastic. But maybe you don't. Maybe a lot of your development processes are super internal. You don't talk to anyone about what you're working on. So at the very least, you should argue with yourself. You should push yourself on your assumptions and make sure that they make sense to you and hopefully to other people. Yes, so some other considerations. I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but the size of your market is also pretty important. It's really hard to correctly size your market. I have no idea how you would do that, but I do know who does. Davis's Venture Catalyst, I think they're in Rack Hall, but they're a center here on campus, and their whole goal is to help students and researchers turn their ideas into companies. And I know for a fact that they can help you size your market. Some key terms that I was trying to remember, but probably didn't earlier, is your total addressable market, or TAM. That's pretty straightforward. It's your total market. It's anyone that might buy your product. Your serviceable addressable market, SAM, it's the market that you fit into specifically. So if my TAM is beauty products and I make lipstick, then lip care is probably my SAM. And then your serviceable obtainable market, or SOM. That's the market you can realistically capture fairly early on, like within the first 3 to 5 years or so. So, maybe I make, I don't know, chapstick, and it's like super long lasting. So my SOM might be people who are outside a lot, hikers, runners, things like that. Maybe that's my SOM. So are there any questions on market validation before we move on? Okay, so we're going to be talking now about preliminary competitor analysis. Now, the competitor analysis we're going to be doing is very high level. It's stuff that you'll often see in companies' pitch decks. It's not going to be very specific, like diving into other companies' finances, because we don't have the time, and frankly, it's not that. It's not really worth the effort if you're running a lean startup. So yeah, the slide basically says what I just said. So we are largely interested, however, in the product or service offerings from other competitors in order to refine and differentiate our product or service. Basically, we want to look at the other people that are doing our job, and we want to say, what are they doing? Why is it good? Why is it bad? Why do people like it? Why do people not? And how do we create something that is better than that? Where can we realistically improve? What are our core competencies going to be? And then move on from that and start actually, developing your product. So provided that you've already identified competitors, you're going to want to track a few key pieces of information, namely what are their offerings. So like I said, what key features do they have, as well as their price point. And often a term that VCs and people in the entrepreneurship community use is, what is their X factor? What's their special sauce? What makes them unique? Maybe they don't have anything, or maybe their special thing is they just have money, so they were able to do it quicker. That is kind of analogous to their core competency or competitive advantage. Those are different things, but they're kind of both analogous to that. The second thing is to look at how well positioned they are. So if you come into this market and you create this product, could they quickly imitate your product or service? And also, could they pressure you out of business? This is really important for if your competitors, if the competitors you have identified are very large companies, like Google is conceivably a competitor of yours, or like the example I was talking about earlier, if Northrop Grumman, who is one of the largest defense contractors in the world, if they're your competitor, think about how they can pressure you out of business and how you can avoid that. There are, of course, other things that you might want to pay attention to, but those are typically dependent on your company. Maybe one is it likely that my competitors will buy me out? That's another way someone can pressure you out of business. That's often the goal of startups, actually. So if that is the case, then good on you. Unless, you want to grow your company from $0 in revenue to 100 million, in which case, then, I don't know, figure it out. So this is an example of what competitor analysis looks like in a slide deck often. It's just like a simple, chart of like, these are the competitors, these are the criteria that we looked at, and these are whether they do well in this. So let's say that we are Mishka's Coffee and Tea here in Davis. We have reasonable cost, they're high quality coffees and teas, great atmosphere, and plenty of study and lounge space. We all know that last one is the lie, but let's pretend. And our competitors in Davis would be Temple Coffee, Starbucks, Pete's, and Phil's. And so this is a really good way of saying these are who we're up against, and this is maybe what they're better at, but this is what we're better at. And so for us, clearly, our key differentiator is that we have space, study and lounge space. And feel free to argue with me on the validity of this chart later. So are there any questions on high-level competitor analysis?
Hi, yeah, I got a question. What's the difference between the regular key features and the X factor? How would a feature be classified as an X factor?
That's a great question. So these features are often things that are common to really any company. So cost, quality, those are two things that are going to pop up in every single company. An X factor might be, for example, if you look at Tesla, their X factor, they kind of have two. One is that they have electric cars. They don't use gasoline. Another might be that they are designed extremely well. So they're aesthetically pleasing. They're also like extremely aerodynamically efficient. So I guess, in my opinion, the use of the word X factor is kind of one of those buzzwords. It doesn't mean a lot. It's just used a lot. But if you do want to give it meaning, I would say that it's something that's out of the ordinary, something that's not common across different industries.
Would you say it's their competitive edge, really?
Yeah, you could say that. Competitive advantages, however, can be in those more general categories. For example, I could be a cost leader and offer my product at a very low cost. That's my competitive advantage. It would be difficult to say that that's an X factor because it's something that's fairly common, you know, across industries.
Awesome.
Cool.
Okay, thank
Great
you.
questions. Yeah, of course. So now we're going to be talking about the business model canvas. This is another one of those things that is required for your submissions. It is a little bit of a beast, but it's not too difficult to understand. This is what a business model canvas looks like. It's just a chart broken up into 9 segments. You have this kind of left side, which talks about your key things, your key partners, activities, and resources. You have your value proposition in the center. And on the right, you have customer related things like customer segments, customer relations, and channels. And then at the bottom, you have cost structure and revenue streams. Now, the purpose of the business model canvas, why this is actually useful, is it's a quick and easy way to explain your business model to someone, to an investor, to a potential co-founder, to maybe a new employee, in a form factor that is well understood. So these are extremely common. In fact, I would say that 99 out of 100 startups have developed a business model canvas at some point. They're also the alternative to, you know, these 40-page business plan reports that were common, you know, 10, 20, 30 years ago. And kind of still are common, but generally only for larger firms and once you've, you know, gotten like $1 million in revenue or something. So we're gonna break down each box. So the value proposition, it's kind of the answer to the problem statement. It is the statement that clearly defines the value that your product or service brings to a customer. So a generic template might be, our business offers this product or service which provides this value to our customers in such a way that it, and then you'd include your differentiation. And like with all of these kind of generic statements, mess around, make it work for your company. Don't just use a cookie cutter thing, you know, use that as a launching pad for coming up with a statement that's more personalized to your company. So earlier we talked about Beachhead market, and that's sort of our first customer segment that the company captures. But if we're going to grow and expand, we also want to capture other segments that, you know, we want more segments, we want larger segments, things like that. So there are kind of 2 ways we can describe our customer segments. The traditional approach would be the use of demographics to describe a group of people. For example, college-age employed women, that's like a demographic thing. Or sort of a jobs to be done approach, which would be using some sort of common action among a group of people to define them. So i.e. Parents who buy their children ice cream when driving them home from school. That's not limited to any demographic. That parent could be 25, that parent could be 48. But the common thing between them is they are driving their kids home and they buy them ice cream so that they shut up. So you can identify your customer segments in those 2 different ways. And often when you're developing a business model canvas as an ideated startup, like something that doesn't have any traction, one thing you might want to do is say, this customer segment is our beachhead. This is what we're going to go after. And these customer segments are ones that we're going to look into acquiring in the future. And you might want to include both of those groups in your business model canvas. Customer relations. So every good company has good relations with their customers. An example of a bad company, by this definition, would be like Comcast. I have never met a single person who has liked their interactions with Comcast's customer service, cable companies in general. So facilitating those relations is the goal of your customer relations portion of the BMC. the business model canvas. So it's not enough to say that we'll have a customer relations department. We'll have someone working on this. Like, oh yeah, Terry in the back, he's talking to, Joey from Wisconsin or whatever. Your business model canvas should discuss how your CR department operates. What are they doing in order to facilitate those relationships? Why is that effective? Why are you doing this? So for example, company X is a business to government B2G company, and they facilitate its customer relations with weekly memos, monthly sit-downs, and detailed quarterly reports. Something that's important to note for customer relations is that you should tailor fit it to whoever your customers are. So if you're B2G, you can expect that you're going to be writing weekly memos, monthly sit-down, scheduling monthly sit-downs, maybe less often than that actually, in detailed quarterly reports. Government agencies love their quarterly reports. I've written so many of them. But if you're B2C, business to consumer, then your customer relations might look a little more like having a call center that's staffed well and is staffed by human beings. Or maybe if you're a business to business, it's a team of biz devs, BDs, that do essentially the same role, but maybe have more specialized knowledge. Channels. So these are the means of actually delivering your value proposition to your customers. So like if I am, let's see, if I am Texas Instruments, I have the calculator in hand. So if I am this company, what is my channel? Amazon. That's my channel. If I'm Hydro Flask, what's my channel? It's Amazon. If I'm Microsoft, my computer is from Microsoft. My channel is probably Amazon. But when you're not talking about physical goods, it's not always Amazon. Probably still is, because they have like a TV network now. But there are other channels to deliver value. So for example, Netflix's user interface, it delivers video content. Amazon itself, their distribution network is sort of their channel, also their website. Zoom meetings. So my channel right now to deliver my value, which is information, hopefully, to you, my customers, is Zoom. This is a channel. Perfect example. Talking through it right now. So key activities. So now we're moving over to the left side of the chart. Key activities kind of seeks to answer the question, what does your day-to-day look like? What are the things that you're doing to maintain your business? What are the things you do in order to maintain your business and operate it? So an example, let's say I own Space Dudes LLC. It's a logistics provider, and we serve the ESA, the European Space Agency. We might have the following key activities. We have to communicate and distribute information with our customers, providers, and employees. As you can expect with rocket launches, there's a lot of information going on or being created. So we need to distribute that. We also have an R&D department to look for more efficient ways to distribute supplies, especially high value supplies. We conduct analysis on the capabilities of our suppliers. So that's kind of like a supply chain management type thing, in order to make sure that we can consider them reliable. And then of course, like any other company, we have business sustaining operations, things like, running admin, running accounting, cooperating with GAAP, GAAP, or whatever, tax agency we need to work with. Key resources. So the three most commonly needed resources are capital, talent, and time. You're going to need all of these regardless of what your business is. Physical space is also pretty common. And of course, key resources aren't limited to those four items. So we can define as key resources as any physical item, intellectual property, or even capability needed to execute an activity. When you're talking about capabilities, you're also kind of talking about core competencies, but we'll just include that in key resources for now. So for example, Let's say I run Flightman and Flightman. It's an immigration law firm. We have the following key resources in addition to capital, talent, and time. We need access to legal literature, forms, regulations, academic writings. So we probably have to pay for those. We need the talent in the clout of the firm's partners. Legal firms often get their customers because the partners, the people at the top, are very reputable. And we need the time, the energy, and the morale of the firm's employees. Immigration law doesn't make a lot of money. People that are in the game are often in the game for moral reasons. So you want to keep your employees happy. And key partners. These are the groups, individuals, or firms that provide your company with one or more of its key resources. So for example, if I operate a new cell phone company, I need each phone's transmitter, the thing that actually sends data. I need each of those things licensed in order to sell my product. In the US, the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, they issue those licenses. So I might consider the FCC, or rather my specific liaison within the FCC, as a key partner. Revenue streams. So revenue streams are recurring or otherwise significant sources of sales revenue. In the weeks prior, when I presented this information before, I said, oh, you should also include like debt, but don't include debt. It's important to keep track of if you're borrowing money, especially if you're like growing. But in general, the point of revenue streams is to keep track of like money that's coming in exchange for your goods or your services. So for example, if I operate an R&D company, my revenue streams might include the licensing of my technology out to other companies or even to government agencies, developing new products for companies or government agencies. These are sort of activities that I do in exchange for money. And of course, receiving grants from government or private institutions. If you ever work for an R&D group, or even if you start a company, which hopefully you all do because you're in the competition, you're probably going to apply for SBIR grants at some point. And a lot of those have to do with, technical developments. And then there are cost structures. Cost structures is a description of the different costs that a company incurs, that takes on in order to deliver its value proposition. So we often take into consideration how or why those costs are incurred. For example, how much of a cost is directly tied to an individual unit of production. This is called variable cost, versus how much of it is independent of activity and thus fixed. Things like rent or insurance. An example of this, again, say we have a legal firm, it's likely to have high fixed costs. It has to pay its partner and its staff salaries, which you could say is variable, but it's going to be the same every month. So it's better to call that fixed. We have to pay rent, and of course we have to pay insurance. And it has pretty low variable costs. Office supplies, sure. Travel expenses, sure. But those are pretty low relative to our fixed costs. Contrary to that, a merchandising company, like one of those stores in San Diego that sells like hats. For some reason, they just sell just hats. I think they have them in LA too. They would probably have very high variable costs. They have to pay for the cost of purchasing their merchandise. Perhaps they have to pay additional licensing costs. If I'm a screen printing shop and I want to borrow some of Disney's iconography, I'm going to have to pay a license for that. Merchandising companies might work in the same way. And additionally, hourly employee wages. So I'm not talking about like staff annual salaries. I'm talking like, the 17-year-old high school grad that works in the back storeroom, 20 hours a week. And it might have relatively low fixed costs. So you might have a manager and then of course rent, which are going to be small compared to our variable costs. So that is business model canvas. That is each component. Yeah, are there any questions on that? Because that was a lot of information. Okay. If you do have questions, again, you can contact me, reach out, whatever. Also, the business model canvas, again, is one of those things that like everyone knows. So if you Google it, you can find it and find really good descriptions, probably better than what I'm able to give. So yeah. Strategic planning. I think this is the last thing for today. So another thing, one of the things that we require for your submissions is plans, 3-week, month, and year plans for growth and development. And I'll be talking more specifically on that after the strategic planning part. So in short, strategic planning is the process of identifying your strategic goals and objectives and charting a path to get there. What do you want to accomplish? When do you want to accomplish it by? Now let's figure out how to get there. The purpose of planning, at least in my opinion, it's not necessarily to develop a step-by-step guide, complete with deadlines and everything else. Those are important and you should have them, but at least I'm more interested in learning the relationships between events and the work to be done required to accomplish your goals. And the reason for that is because if you hit a major roadblock, which you will, especially as a startup, your plans are going to get thrown to the side. Your deadlines are going to be radically altered. What won't change, however, is you're still going to need to run analysis on that component. You still need to conduct interviews with this group of customers. You're still going to need to do all of those little things that you've identified, hopefully, through the strategic planning process. You're still going to need to do those things. And so understanding the relationships between all of these different things, these events, is going to be quite useful when you do run into that roadblock. Maybe you run into a 3-month delay in the manufacturing of some component for your special project or whatever. What are you going to do now? You have all of this time, you have the talent of your team. You don't want to lay them off and then have to hire new people in 3 months. So maybe there's other work that we can do that isn't necessarily totally related to that component. Maybe there's additional analysis, or maybe there's manufacturing on other things that we can take care of. Maybe there's different ways of utilizing the talent that's now held up. And by having that understanding, we're going to be better prepared in order to do that. Yeah. So how do we do this? How do we strategically plan? The first step in the process that I kind of use is identify those major strategic objectives and when you would like to complete the buy. Maybe you want to, maybe in 3 weeks, you want to have a iterated business model canvas. You want to completely redo what you accomplish in this week, and you want to do that by executing, customer interviews. You want more information to go into it. Maybe that's your objective. And maybe even more long-term, in 3 years, you want to acquire 30% of your serviceable, obtainable market. That's your 3-year goal, or maybe 80%, who cares? Those are your major objectives, and those are when you want to complete them by. So now what we want to do is we want to segment the time leading up to this objective, and do that by identifying important steps along the way. So in the context of growing to 80% of our SOM, well, what do we need to do in order to be able to support that level of activity? Well, we're going to need to, let's assume we sell physical goods. We're going to need to establish a distribution network. We're going to need to establish a supply chain. We're going to need to develop a brand, market our stuff, all of these major things. Not to mention, we need a product. We need to develop this thing. and test it, do A/B testing, all this fun stuff. So identify all those major steps, figure out like where realistically we should be doing them. If we want 80% of our SOM in 3 years, we're probably going to need to start marketing like in less than 3 years. We're going to want to start marketing in 2 years. We want to generate all that growth, in that 1 year gap, or maybe we want to start now. Maybe we start marketing tomorrow. Figuring those things out, and that's going to, of course, be unique to your company and to your work. I'd also recommend talking to, if you know anyone that has gone through this, that has started a company, talk to them and see when they did certain things. If you have partners or investors, talk to them, say when they think you should be working on these things, because often this stuff is kind of guesswork if you don't know what you're doing. So working with other people, gathering information from experts, super, super critical to your success. Step 3 would be, of course, to identify the work needed to complete each step and incorporate this into your plan. If I want to start marketing in 3 months, I need to start developing a marketing plan. I probably need a marketing person because I don't know how to market anything. The only reason why you know about Startup Week, it's not because like I shared some Facebook messages or whatever. It's because we had like 3 awesome marketing experts, 4 awesome marketing people to try to spread the word out. Shout out Jasmine and Mahima. And step 4, identify the relationships between the work to be done, the events, and the objectives. This last step is done best through a Gantt chart, which I think is on the next slide. Yes, it is. So a Gantt chart is basically just like a visual representation of what work you're doing and by when. So, on this bottom axis, we have our days, and on the side axis, we have the different areas that we're working in. And this is like a completely arbitrary Gantt chart. So, yes?
The chart, how do you spell the chart's name? Gantt chart?
Oh, yeah, Gantt, Gantt. It's named after some guy named Gantt. Probably Charles, I don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So what I mean by the relationship between tasks is one of the ways you can discuss these relationships is by the use of critical path items, or CPIs. It's a term that NASA uses, and it's actually quite useful. So let's say we have task 3.1 here. Before we can start task 3.1, we need to finish 2.1 and 1.1. That is to say, task 1.1 and 2.1 are critical path items to 3.1, because without them, we cannot continue along our path. They are critical, if you will. And then 1.2 is just hanging out here. These CEs, at least in my approach, I like to cap off the conclusion of each project or event with some sort of event, whether it be symbolic or more pragmatic. These events can look like anything from printing your final report on your research paper and delivering it to your PI. It can be something as kind of symbolic as that, to maybe something as formal as having a complete CDR, a critical design review, and being criticized by experts and having them prod you and ask you questions. That's something that would be like really formal. It could be even more informal. Maybe you just you finish your project and so you go home and have a beer. You just celebrate. Something to cap things off. I found that is a really nice way to mentally separate tasks, and also to reward yourself. Delivering a research paper feels good. So do things like that. Incorporate those into your plans. So I wanted to talk kind of briefly about the 3-week, month, and year plans. This isn't explained super well in the competition packet, and that's on purpose. because I want to reward you all for coming here. So what I mean by these 3-week, month, and year plans, we talked about in the strategic planning method that I've kind of given to you. There's this component of when you would like to complete things by. And so it's rarely beneficial to have just a 1-year plan, just a 5-year plan, just a 10-year plan, or whatever. And the reason why I say that is because you need something more near term. You need something more long term. These sorts of segmenting of time or thinking about time in different scales, at least in my experience, has proven quite useful and being effective. So what I'd like to see in all of your submissions is, in the next 3 weeks, what is your goal? What is your strategic objective? And what are you going to do to accomplish that? You don't necessarily have to do this in a Gantt chart. You can say this in 3 sentences. In the example submission that I wrote for you all, the 3-week plan is like 2 sentences long. It's not anything too overboard. And then also, what are you going to do in the next 3 months? And what are you going to do in the next 3 years? Ideally, I would like to actually see a lot of you, your teams, doing these things. We really want to see companies come out of the Startup Center, both because, frankly, it looks good for us, but also, and more importantly, because, at the Startup Center, we really believe in carving your own path and charting your own future. And we believe that entrepreneurship is one of the best ways to do that. So we really want to see a lot of you follow up on your projects, on your submissions, and see them kind of flourish into real companies. So this is kind of our way of forcing you to think about the future. Startup Week might not end this week for you, hopefully. So some quick review. I've talked about a lot of stuff, a quarter's worth. So let's go over it to make sure it's all kind of fresh in your mind as you begin to work on your submissions. So we discussed problem identification, figuring out what you're going to work on, starting big, going small, getting specific. There's 2 approaches that I've outlined: the problem solution approach, which is more traditional. People are dealing with a problem and it sucks. You're offering the solution. And then there's the jobs to be done approach. People need this job to be done. You're going to do it for them. And hopefully with a greater added value than your competitors. We talked about market validation and external factors, thinking about whether or not there are going to be paying customers in your market, thinking about how you're going to get started, who is your beachhead, are they well connected, are they well funded. We talked about, we talked about preliminary competitor analysis, looking at what their offerings are they good, in what ways, and how are you going to be better. We talked about the business model canvas at length and all the different components. At the end of the day, it's a concise, hopefully, way of presenting what it is that you as a company do. And finally, we touched on strategic planning, which is just the process of identifying your objectives and figuring out how you're going to execute on them. So thank you, everyone. I really appreciate you sitting with me for, we're under time, for 1 hour and 11 minutes. I suppose 8 minutes, because we started like 3 minutes after the hour. So thank you. If you have questions, I will be here for a minute.